Welcome to We Virginians, a conversation about public policy in the Commonwealth. My name is Marisa Porto, and I'm a longtime news editor and publisher in Virginia. We are here today to talk about police reform in the Commonwealth and across the nation in the wake of George Floyd's death at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer late last month. Our guests today are Delegate Marcia Price, who is representing the 95th District, which includes parts of Newport News and Hampton. And also we have Dr. David Taylor, who is the chair of sociology at Hampton University and an expert in criminal justice. So thank you all for being here today. I appreciate you all coming to share your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get started. So since Mr. Floyd's death, there have been protests around the world, calls for racial equality, calls for police reform, in particular to talk about the banning the chokeholds. Earlier this week, the House Democrats rolled out the Policing Act of 2020, which would ban chokeholds. It would also add dashboards, require body cams. It would also include training against racial profiling, also a database of bad police officers across the country, as I understand it. So we'll start there and we'll ask you, and we'll start with Delegate Price. Can you tell us what are your thoughts about that Policing Act and how it may change Virginia?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on this opportunity to speak. It's a little intimidating to be on with a policing expert, but I can speak from the legislative side. And I first would like to uplift that I think a lot of the momentum that you're seeing in this movement calling for reform was not just about the horrific murder of George Floyd, but we also have to uplift the names Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, and also point out that there are new names that have been added to the list of people who have been killed at the hands of police since the protest started right after that event. So I do want to put this, it can't be really in a vacuum. And then also for me, I'm newer in a sense to this than some folks that have been fighting for this for decades. I became a delegate in 2016. And I remember I was giving a floor speech and I almost said Black Lives Matter from the House floor. And I had to stop myself because I didn't want to lose my committee assignments, because that's how I'm effective for the people that I'm representing. And then you fast forward to 2017, I give what I thought was a thought-provoking speech at a police graduation. And it ended up being one of the most offensive things ever said about police, when I was literally asking for them to be their best selves when they come into my neighborhood. And then you fast forward to today, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, we might actually get some change, because this is unlike anything I've ever seen. And so I think within this moment, you start to hear more about things that people are fighting for. So the Justice and Policing Act, it sounds like this new thing that we came up with on the federal level, you know, because of the new activity. And I'm like, oh no, I remember Congressman Scott talking about the death in police custody when Freddie Gray was murdered 4 years ago. And, you know, Kamala Harris has been talking about this and Barbara Lee has been talking about this. It actually just has new life because of the moment. And a lot of these policies people have been fighting for on the federal level and the state level as well. So what I am glad is that the Congressional Black Caucus took front stage and was able to claim the work that they've been doing. But now I think the nation has new ears because of everything that has happened within the last, let's say, 10 days. And so I think that's the moment where we are. And then it trickles down. Okay, for the state, what of those recommendations does Virginia already have in place? What needs to be updated within the code? What isn't an issue with the code, but it's an issue with implementation within the departments? And then what is a cultural issue? So I think those are the pieces that we're looking at for the state. Will we have the opportunity to do that in special session this year, or will it be January? Unclear, but we have legislation ready because we've been putting these things forth and trying to beat this drum for so long. So I think that is the difference in the moment now versus what may have been previous.
Dr. Taylor, do you have any thoughts on the matter? Because it does sound like what you're saying is that people are willing to hear it now, which maybe this moment has allowed for that. I don't know. Dr.
Well, yes, ma'am. First, I want to say thank you for inviting me to this forum. So I think that the events with George Floyd, it was eye opening for many people. I think that many times in the past, when we look at police brutality or misconduct, it happens in the shadows and it hasn't really come to the forefront. Over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been several cases, that people have recorded, it has been played on Facebook and other social medias. So now there's more attention that's being given to it. And so I was reading through the Justice of Police Act, and I think that there are some wonderful measures that they are proposing, and I hope that they are passed. I'm pretty sure there's going to be some conflict when it gets to the Senate and the Republican side. But I think that when we talk about accountability, it's important that police officers are held accountable. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of authority. And I think that when you give people a lot of power and authority, sometimes there are going to be some people who may take advantage of that and who may not be as responsible as we would want them to be, particularly when you come in contact with people in the public. And as for working in the African-American community, I think policing, it's important. I really focus on community policing. I think that it's important that police officers, that they connect with the people that they serve. For far too long, we had police officers who lived outside of the communities that they serve, and there's no connection to the people in the communities. So I think with this measure, it's going to hold police officers accountable. I think that when we need to collect better data so that we can look at the different trends, so that we can follow up on them. And I think that if people can see that police officers are truly trying to connect with them and make a difference, I think that they would be willing to extend their hand to also work with police officers, because combating crime is a joint effort. It's not something that police can do by themselves, and so they're gonna need the public. In regards to Virginia, I think Virginia, I read the Attorney General's statement, and I think it's a good idea if the Attorney General and the state level, if they had more power to do investigations. I think so many times when we look at the criminal justice system and police system, that there is this band that people band together. So, we talk about the blue wall of silence. And so that is something that is very real. Police officers, it's a dangerous job. And I have utmost respect for them and what they do. But I think that there are some people who are part of the culture, the traditional police culture, that are unwilling to change and unwilling to open up. But I think in 2020, the 21st century, we need to include more people. We need to bring more people into the fold so that we can address issues in every community.
I'm muted. You said you wanted to see more data. What kind of data do you want to see in particular that you think would help us as we move forward as a country in the area of public safety?
I think when you look at data, particularly when we look at the frequencies of who is stopped, the reasons why they are stopped, the number of people who are searched, because just because a person is stopped, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be searched. But we know that sometimes, the data shows that minorities, that they are searched at a higher rate than other groups of people. Even when you look at the stop and frisk policies that was in New York City and other cities, and when we look at the data, we see that the African Americans and Hispanics, that they are stopped at a higher rate. So I think it's important that there's clarity, so everybody can understand, have a full understanding of what is going on in police departments around the country.
There's a sort of bad apple theory of the discussion that's going on, right? It's that there's a couple of bad apples in the mix, and the rest of the folks who are in the public safety realm are good people who are trying to do their jobs. There's some research that says, some bad apples are attracted to the law enforcement career because there's some authoritarianism, inherently involved in it. There's also, as you suggested, Dr. Taylor, this sort of blue wall secrecy that might be involved in a culture of policing. I guess we'll start with Delegate Price on this one and say, what kind of training, what kind of training and hiring needs to be done? Is there something different or better that we can do as part of, as the Commonwealth to help that in the future?
Yeah, first I'd like to say to Dr. Taylor's point, this year the General Assembly passed House Bill 1250, which is a community policing bill that has that data collection as a component of it. It's very hard to say what a problem is. I know with my constituents, I have anecdotal evidence, but in order to do policies, sometimes you need that quantitative analysis as well. So that is going to be passed, so we'll be able to see at what rate are minorities, Black people being pulled over and searched. And then also one of the things that has to happen as well is talking to the people that have lived experiences in heavily policed communities. And so when you do that, you understand that it is not about individuals, it is about systems. And so I have, I'll drop the line. I know some very good police officers, right? And they are not offended with what we are trying to do on the national or state level because they're already walking around these streets being held accountable to themselves. And so they don't have a problem with a lot of the things that we're discussing. Makes sense. It makes sense that you should have a love for the community that you're policing. And other thing I think is a shift in perspective from enforcement to public safety. And why are you there? Are you joining the force for an adventure? Or are you joining the force because you have a genuine love for people and want to keep them safe? And so how do you weed out who is who? And I think that's where the hiring process has to be changed. I have been told by a couple of city attorneys that police departments are not allowed to talk with each other, and then they cite some law. And then I have lawyers that are telling me that work within the executive branch that are saying, no, absolutely, it's right here. You should talk to each other. And so we're going to make that more clear for everyone. What should be happening behind the scenes so we're not passing around these bad apples. But if a bad apple is able to go from district to district and be a bad apple, that is a systemic problem. And if we have all of the best policies in the world in place, but we still have a community that is afraid of its law enforcement, then there is a cultural issue that also speaks to systems. And so if you're offended by us wanting to have law enforcement officers held accountable, then I say you either don't have the experience of living in a heavily policed community, or you're protecting one of those bad apples. This is about changing systems so that people can live in healthy communities, so that the right people can show up for the right emergencies, and so that if someone is going, let's say the training between someone who is actively being belligerent to someone who is under the influence of a substance or has a developmental disability or has is having a mental health crisis, the showing up of an armed, uniformed officer can already escalate just by presence. And a lot of officers understand that and have actually asked for some of these to not be part of what their duty is, because that's not A, what they're trained for, and B, what is helpful to the situation. So I think we have to look within the systems and how the systems are currently interacting. If our jails are where most people get mental health services, then we are already saying we failed. That is a failure. And if people are feeling like they can't sit on their steps because there's crime, that is a failure. So how do we look at all of this, but also have people that look like me be able to look and think about officer friendly in the same way that some of my white colleagues have a few of that officer friendly? And it's not just the one officer, it's the entire system. And so I think that's the perspective that we're taking, at least when we're looking at legislation. So if something is happening to the point where there was a protest in every single state and multiple countries around the world, if something is happening to the point where people are calling for a disbanding of their police systems, I think that we can say that that is well beyond a few bad apples, and we've got to look at the deeper underlying systemic racism within these structures.
Yeah, Can I add to that, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so when I think about hiring, it is very important, as Delegate Price said, that it's important that police officers, that we need to be able to have a connection with them. They need to understand the environments, the communities that they are serving. And so when we look at hiring new people, I wrote a paper many years ago, and it was looking at the riots from the 1960s, and how the Kerner report was written, and it was saying how society was evolving into two separate societies, one that's white and one that's black. And so the same scenarios are playing out again in 2020. We have, riots in the streets. We have mass marches. And so people are calling for some type of change. And so I think that part of that change has to be hiring people who are sensitive to the conditions of the neighborhoods that they're serving. I think far too long we had police officers who lived, in the suburbs, and who really just came to the city just for entertainment or for, shopping or other purposes. You don't really get a sense of the communities when you live like that, or when you just come in for short periods of time. So as we look at hiring more people, I think it's important that we look at the processes for which we are bringing police officers in. I think we need to hire more women to be on the force. We need to hire more African Americans and Hispanics and Asians, because we live in a diverse society. And so I believe that the police department should represent the people that they serve. And so for far too long, we had the traditional police culture, which was pretty much white male dominant. And so society it's not that way. Society has changed. It has evolved. And I think that some police officers, not all, of course, there are some good police officers, there's some bad police officers. There's good people and there's bad people. And so it's important that we use very many different screening measurements to identify who can we trust with the authority to go into our communities and to interact with people, and when necessary to arrest folks. Because I think you can't just defund the police department and abandon it altogether. I don't think that's realistic. I think that there has to be some changes. You have to look at who you're bringing in. You need to do extensive background checks, look at psychological assessments. So there are a lot of different things that needs to be done as far as bringing in people, qualified people who are willing to work with a diverse group of people. And I think as far as they go through training, it should be an ongoing training, as far as diversity training, implicit bias training, de-escalation training. Delegate Price, you mentioned about mental health conditions, people dealing with people with mental health issues. That is important, because we do have a high percentage of people who are incarcerated who have mental health issues. And when you look at the low-income communities, particularly the minority communities, most of those people will not get any mental health services until they are part of the criminal justice system. And so I think that we need to have some mechanisms in place so that we can provide services to those needy communities. And so maybe reallocating some funds would be an idea, which is part of the defunding. Call for defunding of the police department. But I think we really need to spend a lot of time looking at the people who we are entrusting with protecting and providing us with services.
And Marissa, if I could just add, I think the sentiment behind the disband movement, I think really also speaks to the training and the screening is on the front end. Like that has to be on the front end, because some of the officers that are involved in the situations that have happened that are now on the national screen, they had training, but were they screened? And I think that's the difference. You can't expect at a police, in a police training to undo racists. Like you're not gonna untrain them from entrenched beliefs and then say, okay, now that you understand implicit bias, go be a good person in this neighborhood full of the people that you actually hate. Like that's not how this works. And so I think the frustration behind, those calls is you're training them now and they're still killing us. And so it's got to be on the front end. But I think there also has to be these accountability measures. And I think, Dr. Taylor and I are saying the same thing. Training and screening on the front end, but what are we doing? What are we doing about the ones that are already on the force? Right. That the training is not going to change their hearts. The training is not going to make them move into the area and be entrenched. Like the training is not going to do these connections. That's where I think some of the legislation for accountability really comes into place, and where it should be very transparent. how many infractions have you had? What type of infractions were there? If you're using excessive force, like what does that mean for your employment as a law enforcement officer? I think that has to be coupled with the training and the screening.
Well, in Virginia, internal investigations against police officers are not open. Once that's done, it's not public record. So, are you saying that's something that Virginia needs to look at moving forward? How does that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I serve on both the General Laws Committee and the Public Safety Committee. So I've been looking at this from, all kinds of ways, but having been on the General Laws Committee and seeing what the FOIA subcommittee goes through, there are a lot of people pushing for certain things to be hidden in a ton of different industries. And so it's an uphill battle, like public transparency is an uphill battle that I know you know about. But there's this idea that, the individual employee, because they are an employee, they have rights. And then there's also the public interest. And so I think it's a matter of weighing it out, but I do believe that you will see legislation, whether in the special session or in January, that deals with that very thing. Because if we are supposed to be citizens working together with law enforcement, there has to be trust. If there is an entire bit of information about these people that are in our neighborhoods that we can't find out information on, where is that trust? If we know that when I used to live in Yorktown, you used to act, a certain way, and now you're on the Newport News Force, like how is that, trust? And so I do understand constitutional rights. I get all of that. And so the legislation that will be put forth has weighed out the rights of the individual, the responsibilities of each of the departments, but then also the true sense of trust that has to occur for community policing to work. And that all needs to be weighed out to get to public safety.
And I think that is the hard part, trying to develop trust in minority communities, trying to get minorities to trust police officers who've had a history in our society of perpetrating some horrible actions against a certain group of people. And so how do you build that trust when minorities, African-American males in particular, when they see a police officer choke a man to death in public in broad daylight? And so the question becomes, so how valuable, is my life? And so I think that for a lot of African-American males in particular, it's going to be hard for them to overcome some of the stuff that they have experienced, and not only their experience, but things that their family and friends have experienced and stuff. So transparency is important. I think that when you look at having police officers on the force who have had numerous complaints against them, and then it is very disheartening for a person to be the victim of that misconduct or that abuse by a police officer, and then you file a complaint, and then you see the police officer in your community again. And so that becomes very hard. The question becomes, so what was the purpose of me even filing the complaint when it was swept under the rug, or this person, he just moved to another department? So one thing that I'm really against is, it seems like when situations occur, police officers, they are given this enormous amount of latitude. And so they are typically put on administrative duties, and they still receive pay. I don't know of any place where you can blatantly violate rules and policies and you still receive a paycheck. And so that is very hard for people in the minority community to accept, when you want us to trust you, or trust the police department, you want us to work with you. But when we see, a police officer who is known for misconduct, he or she, well, most of the time he is still on the police force. When I look at the traditional policing model, that is, it's a very macho environment. It's a very male-dominated environment. And so it would be very difficult to come in and to change, as Delegate Price said, change a person's heart. So you can implement policies and you can enact laws to regulate and control people's behavior, but how do you change a person's heart? And so when there's no one around to monitor them or to supervise them, will they still do the right thing? Will they have the integrity to do what is right, regardless of the race or ethnic background of a person who they're interacting with?
Some police departments are saying that they're starting policies, like I saw in Newport News in Virginia, They started a new policy that says if an officer sees another officer, regardless of rank, do something inappropriate involving a citizen, that they are required by the police department rules to stop that from happening. What do you think about that as far as sort of helping with the trust issue?
I was watching the news the other night, and one of the attorneys for one of the fight officers in Minneapolis, and he indicated that his client would simply follow the instructions of Officer Chauvin, and that his client was only on the force, I think, for maybe 4 or 5 days, and so he was not in a position to go against the instructions of the senior officer. I think that sounds good, but I think in the heat of the moment when events are occurring and things are happening rapidly, I think it would take a very strong person, a very strong junior person, to go against the instructions or the directives of a senior officer. I would hope that would happen, because perhaps if that would have happened, then Mr. George Floyd would still be alive today. But I think that is putting a lot of pressure on junior people who are just starting off in their careers. And so I think that as people move into the policing profession, they have to ask themselves, what would I do in a situation like that? I think the best thing to do is you have to try to see yourself in very troubling situations to understand or to have an idea of what you would do. It would be nice, and I hope that most police departments will adopt this policy, that if you see something that you need to say something. But I think that that's still going to be very difficult, because of that blue wall of silence, that connection, that culture that exists in the police department, where people stick together. But hopefully the events that's happening here with George Floyd, hopefully police officers will stand up. And I hope they stand up, because that can save lives.
Delegate Price, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it was very telling that when Chief Drew announced that they had added specific language in to say the thing that you just said, that if you see something, you will intervene. He said that he never thought, I'm paraphrasing, he never thought that he would have to put that in writing, because that's what they're there for. Like, that's their jobs. But after the protests and after the demands, and also after seeing how it didn't happen in Minneapolis, he was like, all right, cool, we're gonna put this in the manual, and then, in their protocols. And so then what I would hope is that so that's policy. Then the other part that I was saying was culture. So now you have to dismantle the culture that has someone afraid to lose their job for trying to save the life of a human being when you're in a profession that's supposed to protect and serve. Like, that's what I mean by systemic. Like, this is a culture that says I could get fired for going up against someone that is my senior officer for trying to save someone's life. And so the way that the economy is, I would never want someone to have to worry about feeding their family or saving someone else. Like, that's Hunger Games type stuff. That's not what we're supposed to be, in the best country in the world. Like, that's not what we're supposed to be about. And so I love that the policy is there. I commend the chief for it, for recognizing that it was missing and needed to be there. And it was very fast. They did it like right after. But then I also want to know, not just for Newport News, but any of these other departments, what are we doing to dismantle the system that would have someone afraid to speak up in that way? And again, this is the sentiment behind some of the disbanding language. Whether you agree with it or not, or think that that's the way that things should go about, you can understand the sentiment. If that's the existing culture, that needs to be torn down. And so I was watching the coverage of Camden, New Jersey had disbanded theirs and restructured it. And the training from the beginning of this new force was some of the things that we were talking about. And then you heard one of the police officers say, I don't care who's in charge of me. If somebody's dying, I'm gonna stop it. And that's what the forces mentality should be, not just a couple of good apples, right? And so these systemic changes, again, are what's going to be necessary to enact the policy, and then in the implementation, the culture within the force being able to embrace the policies.
Can I add to that real quick?
Yes, sure.
And I think when you look at the policy, that goes back to accountability, because you can have all the policies in the world, but if you don't have people with integrity to monitor, supervise, to make sure that these policies are being carried out, then their policy is just a waste of time. And so I think as we look at, who we're going to bring on the police force, and it's important that we do these background checks so that we can look at a person to see, what standards, what are their morals, what are their values, with their mental health capacity. There's a lot of things that we need to look at, because you're talking about people's lives here, and this is very important. So yeah, I hope that policy will last. I think that we've seen a lot of stuff coming out of different cities and different states on the federal level, within the last 2 weeks, but these are issues that existed for a long period of time. So these are issues that should have been addressed many decades ago. And so I hope that this energy that the young people have, the politicians and everybody else have, that they can sustain it for the long haul, because it's gonna require a long period of time for these things to take hold, for us to weed out the bad police officers, to bring in the good police officers, to develop that trust. Because developing trust doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take a long, sustained effort.
There, just one last question, and that is, so the Virginia Police Association has sent some recommendations to the Governor Northam in Virginia to help in the effort to standardize police procedures and policies. And one of the things that was in there was that that decertification of an officer right now really only happens under, the case of sort of moral turpitude. You have to be convicted of a crime, convicted of a felony, and then, a particular kind of misdemeanor. And this, one of the suggestions was decertification for purposes of integrity. And I guess I wonder what you all think about that. That's sort of an interesting standard. So your thoughts, Delegate Price?
So, of course, when we're talking about laws, we have to define terms. So we have to define like what constitutes, because if we're going to go into ethical versus legal, those have to be clearly defined, so that if someone were to be brought up on charges of breaking this, that it can withstand the test of being, sued or challenged in court. So that is actually being worked on. You will find that there are quite a few comprehensive pieces of legislation that the House Democratic Caucus is going to be putting forward. And it is a lot of this, like if you, and any other job, like Dr. Taylor said, this doesn't happen in any other job. Like if you are, in this industry and you do something like really, really bad, there should be a consequence that is not just loss of pay, or is just not just loss of that position, especially depending upon how terrible the act is. But some of the immoral things might be immeasurable if the system is already perpetuating those immoral things as well. So it's very interesting to me that the system that has from back in, when Black men were being lynched, police officers were out there in uniform watching, to go to, okay, now we are gonna, the law is, the government, who is in so many systems, whether it's economic, health, or we have racism all throughout the foundation of government. We're gonna now say, okay, we are the moral high ground, now y'all gotta go play nice. And it'll be really interesting to see how the words get put together within the policy. But again, even within that policy, what I think is also coupled with that is the citizen review board idea of people coming to the table, people who are being policed coming to the table and telling you what they think is ethical or not, as opposed to top down. So if you are living in a community where these infractions are happening, you can say, yeah, no, that's not right. Well, we're okay with that. We don't like that. No, that's really not okay. Like, that kind of feedback has to be a major part of this. And so policing is local. So I'll go to Richmond and we'll make laws for the entire Commonwealth, but how that is done and the definition of what the culture is on a local level. And so there has to be local participation amongst the residents that have input on that as well. I think it is going to be a very interesting conversation, and I can't wait to see the language of the bill to see if it goes far enough.
All right. And would you like to just give us a little bit of an insight into maybe what some of those pieces of legislation might be, since you brought it up a couple of times, Delegate Price?
Yeah, so I'm working on 7 pieces of legislation, and it's hard to really roll them out at this moment because we want to manage expectations. We have not passed the resolution for what we have heard is going to be a special session. I don't even know the date, but as soon as we have more concrete information as to whether or not it's going to happen in August, and we'll be able to talk about these topics in August, or if it's going to be in January, I think that's a very important step first. But there are pieces of legislation, like I said, from the national recommendations, from the Justice and Policing Act, from the lived experiences of Virginians across the Commonwealth. These are a lot of bills that have been put forth for the last decade and just updated to match the times. So if, you know, it might used to say what we now consider offensive words for mental health crises or substance use disorders. So updating language, but these concepts aren't new, like at all. So if you can just go back to previous sessions and see what members of the Congressional Black Caucus have been fighting for, even me, I have had something about policing each year to include the ability for police departments to connect and talk with each other before someone is hired, to include better training standards and what training needs to happen. And we also need to look at this idea of uniform. Right now, there is nothing uniform about how policing is held accountable across the Commonwealth. So if you have 39 different, regional, accredited, not accredited, but if you have 30 different training modules that they're using to teach, how do I know when I'm in a city what kind of police I'm encountering? And so I really think that the sentiment behind a lot of these bills is raising the bar for what the minimum standards are, and then also increasing accountability.
Well, I want to thank you both for joining us today. I mean, we can spend a lot more time on this topic, but I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to talk with both of you about your insights, and it's a very there's a lot of information to unpack in this public policy discussion. We'll stop here, and I'll say thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It's been a pleasure talking with both of you, and we look forward to seeing Delegate Price what you bring to the table, either in August or whenever the session is. And for those of you who are still watching, if you made it this far, we'd appreciate it if you would like our channel on YouTube. And also, we'll have more conversations coming. And so thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.